and Prasutagus was set up as an official client king of the Roman Empire. In an attempt to keep control of his tribe within the family, Prasutagus filled out a will that left Iceni territory jointly to the Romans on the one hand and his wife and daughters on the other. But when the king died, the Roman procurator of the province, a particularly rapacious character named Catus Decianus, announced that patriarchal Rome did not recognize the rights of women when it came to inheritance. The claims of the Iceni were denied, and their territory was annexed by Rome. To the Britons, who had no problem with women inheriting property or holding positions of authority, this was incomprehensible. It was right and good that the king's wife should rule upon his death and his daughters grow up to be queens. So when Boudica, the widow of the dead king, went about her business as usual and paid no more or less tribute to the Romans than before, she was shocked at the Roman reaction. Soldiers were sent to her village. Boudica was tied up and flogged, while her daughters were carted off and raped. These ghastly acts committed, the Romans believed that they had put the upstart women in their place and thought no more of it, little realizing that they had just lit a fuse that was burning quickly down towards the powder keg that was Queen Boudica. With the Roman governor of Britain, Gaius Suetonius Paulinus, leading the majority of the British legions on a campaign on the Isle of Anglesey in Wales, Boudica took the opportunity to translate her fury into action. After convincing a neighboring tribe to join in the fun, Boudica gathered everyone up and declared war on Rome. The first stop was Camulodunum, the original headquarters of the Roman occupying force and site of a great temple built to the now divine Claudius. When Roman scouts brought back word that a huge force of Britons was headed straight for the city, the call for reinforcements went out. But with the bulk of the British legions occupied in Wales, the procurator Decianus decided that Boudica's revolt wasn't worth rearranging the remaining garrisons for, and only sent an additional 200 troops to Camulodunum. Not surprisingly, 200 more troops didn't do the Romans in the city much good, as Boudica's force had to be in the tens of thousands. I'm having trouble tracking down an accurate headcount for them. The Briton rebels easily crashed the gates, forcing the surviving Romans to make a last stand in the barricaded temple of Claudius, where, after 2 days of fighting, they were annihilated. Camulodunum was then burned to the ground. After the scale of the danger posed to the residents of Camulodunum became apparent, a detachment of 2,500 men from a nearby legion were sent to reinforce the city. But by the time they arrived, it was too late. They showed up just in time to find the smoldering remains of Camulodunum and a horde of British warriors with their hackles raised and nothing else to do. The subsequent encounter, known as the Massacre of the Ninth Legion, When news of the destruction of Camulodunum reached Suetonius in Wales, he immediately abandoned his campaign and marched straight for the new commercial center of Londinium, founded 20 years before and thriving nicely. But upon arrival, he assessed the situation and decided the new city was indefensible. With Boudica marching straight for them, he abandoned the town and looked for a better position from which to direct his counterattack. Boudica had no trouble overrunning undefended Londinium. She burned it to the ground and slaughtered anyone crazy enough to stay in the city after Suetonius left with his legions. Boudica then marched on Verulamium, the site of modern St. Albans, and put it too to the torch. This string of victories was gaining Boudica quite a reputation, and disaffected Britons from across the country flocked to her banner. The Romans were on the run, and with a little luck, they might just be run off the island altogether. But Suetonius was not ready to give up just yet. He managed to gather about 10,000 troops, composed of portions of a few legions and irregular auxiliary forces, and stationed them at a defensible position in the West Midlands, along a trade route known later as Watling Street. Though reports that Boudica led 230,000 warriors is certainly an exaggeration, there is no doubt that the Romans were massively outnumbered. Tacitus reports that though Suetonius arrayed his men in a single line, it was not enough to match the length of the far deeper British army. But Suetonius knew what he was doing and had placed himself at a spot where only so many Britons could attack at any one time, partially negating the huge numerical disadvantage he faced. Boudica roused her army with a speech imploring them to make this moment the last moment for the Romans in Britain, and reminding them that she stood before them not as an aristocrat whose power had been usurped, but as a free woman whose liberty had been denied. Victory would mean freedom. Defeat would mean slavery. Unfortunately for the British, as we have seen so many times before, when it came to set-piece battles out in the open, the Romans were second to none, even when they were outnumbered 10-1. When the British charged, the Roman line formed into a wedge and drove into the oncoming mass of warriors. Before too long, the British discovered the difficulty of breaking a disciplined Roman line and began to retreat. But Boudicca's army was not just an army. It was also a rolling caravan of her entire tribe, and before the battle, she had stationed the wagons and dependents who made up the rest of the troop behind the actual warriors. Now that the army was in full retreat, they ran headlong into the stationary wagons, and chaos ensued. Utterly snarled, the Romans were able to descend and go into slaughter mode. Of the 230,000 Boudicca led into the Battle of Watling Street, 80,000 now lay dead on the plain. Roman losses were put at 400. Her revolt shattered, Boudicca drank poison to avoid capture. Boudicca's rebellion very nearly caused Nero to abandon Britain altogether. Had she been able to lure Suetonius onto less favorable ground, it is likely that her far superior numbers would have been able to overwhelm him. But in the end, if there was one thing the Romans did really well, it was running a savvy military operation, so the counterfactual just doesn't hold up. Having abandoned Londinium, it was clear that the one thing Suetonius was not going to do was be lured onto unfavorable ground. Inevitably, Boudicca's furious revolt was going to run into the cold, careful planning of the Roman legions, and, like so many before her, she would be destroyed by it. Rome was pleased to hear the good news arriving from Britain that the uprising had been quelled, but they were simultaneously nonplussed by the news coming in from the east. Having set a Roman client back on the throne of Armenia, Corbulo had settled conditions in the east back into their natural state. But Tigranes VI, the new king of Armenia, immediately tried to upend the apple cart by raiding into Parthian territory. Where before the Parthian king Vologases had regretfully deemed the Armenian situation a low priority, invasions into Parthia itself were another matter. Reacting to the enraged pleas from his loyal subjects, the Parthian king settled his other business and turned back to the Mediterranean. He formally announced that his brother Tiridates was still the rightful king of Armenia and recrowned him as such. A Parthian force then invaded Armenia and attempted to dislodge the Roman garrisons, but they were unsuccessful. Hoping to keep things civil, Corbulo met with Vologases, and it was agreed that both empires would leave the disputed country while envoys from Parthia traveled to Rome and attempted to work out a deal. But by the spring of 62, no deal had been struck, and hostilities were renewed. This time, with Corbulo focused on protecting the key province of Syria from possible attack, Nero appointed a legate named Lucius Sicinius Paetus to spearhead operations in Armenia. The new commander took 2 legions and marched them straight toward Tigranocerta, which had been seized by the Parthians. But after a few easy but minor victories, he was forced to withdraw when winter came due to an unsteady supply line before reaching the southern capital. The ease of the first year's campaign had lulled Paetus into a false sense of security. When, in early 63, this false sense of security was shattered, he quickly showed himself to be a pretty awful commander. Unable to make any headway against Corbulo's fortifications in Syria, which Vologases had been planning to invade, the Parthian king decided to abandon the attempt and just go for broke in Armenia. So when the second Parthian army, which Paetus had not accounted for, suddenly appeared along the Roman-Armenian border where he was camped for the winter, Paetus panicked. Having sent his officers away on leave and having dispersed the rest of his troops across the countryside, Paetus was in no position to fight the Parthians. He hastily ordered the troops he had on hand to blockade the various passes in the mountains to prevent the Parthians from entering Roman territory, but this had the effect of only dispersing his already dispersed troops even more. The Parthians were able to easily overrun these small detachments, forcing Paetus to fall back into his fortified camps outside of Randia. Facing imminent doom, Paetus was paralyzed. The most proactive thing he could think of to do was to call Corbulo for help. Having never liked Paetus to begin with, Corbulo took his sweet time gathering a relief force, but when the reports became sufficiently dire, he marched out half the men at his disposal and attempted to reach the besieged legions in time. En route, Paetus had given up and surrendered to Vologases. The terms of the surrender were humiliating for Rome. The Parthian king demanded that the defeated army build him a bridge across a nearby river so his entourage could march over it victoriously. Then, according to some sources, he allowed the Romans to leave only after marching them under the yoke, which, as you recall from the Battle of the Colline Gate during the Samnite Wars, was about as humiliating as it gets. The remnants of Paetus' army met up with the approaching legions led by Corbulo, and despite Paetus' pleas to keep fighting, Corbulo refused and led the whole force back to Syria, unwilling to risk getting entangled with the Parthians at a time and place of their choosing. Having driven the Romans out of Armenia, Vologases sent envoys to Rome to work out a new peace accord. When the envoys arrived, though, Nero and the Senate were shocked to discover the magnitude of Paetus' defeat. Though he had been communicating his ever-worsening position to Corbulo, Paetus had continued to send cheerful letters back to Rome, acting as if nothing was amiss. So when Parthian envoys showed up with news of Roman legions marching out under the yoke, the leaders of Rome had trouble fitting this revelation into their heads. For God's sake, the triumphal arch, marking the defeat of the Parthians in Armenia, was already halfway constructed. What are we supposed to do with a halfway built triumphal arch? Turn it into a giant swing set? Paetus was immediately recalled to Rome, and Corbulo was given emergency imperium over the entire Eastern Empire. His job was to whip the Parthians and make sure that it stuck this time. Corbulo led a large force out of Syria and into Armenia to do just that, but before a battle could be fought, Vologases sent word that he wanted to deal. He knew full well that Corbulo was not Paetus, and that the Romans would not be taken so easily again. So the two sides met and struck a deal. Henceforth, Parthia would be able to appoint the monarch of Armenia, but their choice had to be ratified by the Roman emperor. Tiridates then laid his diadem down in front of a statue of Nero the Romans had brought, and swore not to put it back upon his head until Nero had placed it there. In 66 AD, Tiridates then did travel to Rome to meet with the emperor and accept his crown. Nero threw a huge party and made a big to-do about his right to crown the king of Armenia, but critics within the Senate and beyond believed the emperor had done nothing less than hand Armenia over to the Parthians. Ratify the candidate that they nominate? What great power is that? But defenders of Nero saw it as a practical move that averted all-out war with the one power big enough to really challenge Rome. In closing out the ceremony, Nero even went so far as to close the rarely closed gates of the Temple of Janus, which signaled the arrival of universal peace. Universal peace, though, never lasts long. Next week, just months after the gates swing shut, they will be opened again. The always simmering province of Judea will finally boil over, leading to what is now known as the Great Jewish Revolt. The historical implications of this brief conflict were vast, as the Romans both destroyed the Temple of Jerusalem and triggered a diaspora of Jews out of the east, with the survivors of the revolt fleeing to communities across the empire, which sowed the seeds for so much medieval and modern tension between Jew and Gentile. This week's episode is brought to you by Audible. As you are now fully aware, Audible is the internet's leading provider of audio entertainment, with over 60,000 titles